There are a lot of difficult passages in the Bible, and this has got to be one of the top ones. There's been debate about Genesis 6, verses 1 through 4 for centuries, going back before the time of Christ already, and it's been interpreted in several different ways. And there really hasn't been a solid consensus. There are several main views, but there's still disagreement among scholars about what this passage exactly means, especially the identity of the sons of God. So I'll say what I can, but I doubt that I'll have the last word on it. And my view was really influenced by a book that I read recently. A Dutch scholar by the name of Jaap Doedens wrote his doctoral dissertation on this passage. Doedens traces the history of interpretation, so you can see all the different views that people have had. And he also then does a thorough study of his own of the passage. So who are the sons of God? Well, one popular view is that the sons of God are the descendants of the righteous line of Seth, who then intermarried with women from Cain's line. But there are a number of problems with this view. For one thing, the women are simply called daughters of man. And the word for man is the word Adam, which simply means mankind. So the easiest way to understand it is that these are simply human daughters, rather than specifically daughters of the line of Cain. Now, that would imply then that the sons of God are non-human, which raises questions of its own, which I'll get to in a second. Another problem with the view that the sons of God were Sethites who then married Cain's women is that doesn't really explain how their children could have been giants. Humans marrying humans just produce ordinary human children. So I've come to agree with Doedens that the sons of God were not human, but they were divinities. Now, then of course you need to explain what that means. There's of course only one God, so how can you speak of multiple divinities? The only God is the Lord, the eternal creator. So to speak of divinities here is to speak of created heavenly beings. The Bible uses the expression sons of God more often that way. For example, in the Job 38:7, God says to Job, "Where were you when I laid the foundations of the earth and the sons of God shouted for joy?" One translation, the NIV, says angels there, but the Hebrew simply says sons of God. And same in Job 1 and 2, we read that the sons of God came to present themselves before the Lord, and Satan also came with them. The book of Psalms also speaks about sons of God, referring to heavenly beings. Now, why not simply call them angels if that's who they are? Well, we should realize that the way we use the word angels is we use it as kind of a catch-all term for all the heavenly beings. Whereas the word angel in Hebrew and Greek actually means a messenger, because one of their roles is to bring messages to God's people on the earth. But there's a whole variety of heavenly beings that God created, not just angels in the strict sense of the word. God also made cherubim, and he made seraphim, watchers, and holy ones, and sons of God. So there's all kinds of different words for these heavenly beings. And they look different from one another as well. Some of them are described as having a human form. Others have quite a different description, like the cherubim and the seraphim, for instance. In other words, the sons of God are among the heavenly creatures that God had made. Now, as I said, that in turn raises a whole series of questions. And the big one is, are heavenly creatures capable of sexual activity with humans? And how would that work? And here we quickly come to the limits of our understanding. So it's no surprise that this passage has been debated as much as it has been. Just yesterday, I saw a new article again by a well-known Old Testament scholar, Ian Duguid, and he's in favor of the view that the sons of God were descendants of Seth. And so the debate goes on. Personally, I think that the view that the sons of God were divinities or heavenly beings actually does more justice to the passage. It was an act of rebellion against God, and it actually helps to make sense of a few New Testament passages as well. 1 Peter 3. Peter there speaks of the spirits in prison who disobeyed long ago in the days of Noah. Spirits in prison. That sounds like Genesis 6, verses 1 to 4. And even more so, the book of Jude. It talks about the angels who did not keep their possessions of authority, but abandoned their own home. And so they're now bound in everlasting chains, awaiting the day of judgment. Why would these sons of God do this? And there, Doedens suggests that maybe the reason for these marriages was to try to create a super race of giants then that could overcome human limitations, overcome the curse of death, maybe kind of an alternate path to immortality now that the way to the tree of life is closed and death has come. But it backfires. In fact, it has the opposite effect. God intervenes by hastening the judgment of death, saying, you've only got 120 years. And when you think about it, marriages like this, procreation between heavenly beings and human women, were completely against God's created order, and it would have wreaked havoc with the image of God. God created Adam and Eve in his image, and he told them to be fruitful and multiply so that, the image of God could continue in the human race. And now here you've got these unnatural unions.
Mm.
And the giants that resulted from these unions actually became mortal enemies of God's people, and they had to be eradicated. Now, that then gets us into the whole Nephilim, Rephaim, Anakim thing. I've talked about the Nephilim. Probably they are the products of the unions between the sons of God and the daughters of men. Now, then what are Nephilim? Well, the earliest translation of the Bible, the Septuagint, translates it as giants, and that's also what you find in the King James Version. And it makes sense. There's another passage, Numbers 13, verse 32. That's where the 12 spies come back to Moses to report on their exploration of the promised land. And 10 of those spies say, all the people that we saw there are of great size. We saw the Nephilim there. And then there's a little explanatory note. The descendants of Anak come from the Nephilim. We seemed like grasshoppers in their eyes, and we looked like that to them. Now, there is some hyperbole there. The 10 spies are trying to instill fear in their countrymen, so they're exaggerating a bit, but they must have been people of unusual size.
Yeah, then there's the six-fingered, six-toed guy.
Yeah.
And then you read about it when Israel comes to conquer the land. There's a few passages that says the descendants of Anak, but there's no real, you can't draw a genealogy here, obviously.
No, no, so their origins are a little bit vague. We know that they were there. We know that they were people of unusual stature and strength, and they always seem to be at the forefront of war against God's people. So they're mortal enemies of God's people. The ones that you mentioned, like the six-fingered, six-toed giant, he was one of the Rephaim. Now, the Rephaim is actually a bit of a complicated one because the word is actually used in two different ways. So one way that it's used is of these giants. 2 Samuel 21 and 1 Chronicles 20 talk about the exploits of David and his mighty men, and they managed to kill the 4 descendants of the Rapha, the Repha. Now, this group goes a long way back. They're mentioned in Genesis 14 already. That's the passage where Abram rescues Lot from Kedorlaomer and so on. And Kedorlaomer had passed through the area, defeating a bunch of nations, including the Rephaim. And then he also captured Lot and carried on, and then Abram defeated him again. And then you have the Melchizedek passage and so on. Another one is Og of Bashan. He was actually, it says in Deuteronomy 3 that he was the last of the Rephaites on the east side of the Jordan, and the Israelites killed him when they took over his territory. And Deuteronomy 3 says that his bed was more than 13 feet long. I forget how many cubits it says. Yeah. So he must have been a giant, and his bed there probably refers to like his sarcophagus, his coffin. It says that it's still located there and you can still see it and so on.
And then Goliath's height is given. He's like 9 feet or something.
Right. He's mentioned as coming from Gath, where some of the Rephaim are said to have come from as well. And some of the Anakim are said to be found in Gath in the Philistine territory as well. Yeah, these are mortal enemies of God's people, and David and his mighty men are the ones who finally defeat them and wipe them out, and then they're finally gone. Now, I mentioned that the word Rephaim is used in two different ways, and that's the tricky part of it. The word Rephaim is also used to refer to the dead in the underworld. There's passages in Psalms and Proverbs and Isaiah that talk about the place of the dead, and they use the word Rephaim there. And then the question is, okay, are there two different kinds of Rephaim? One referring to the dead in the underworld, and the other one referring to this family of giants? Or are they one and the same because those giants actually became extinct and they ended up dead in the underworld, right? So maybe it's the same group. It's a bit hard to figure out.
Oh, wow, weird. Yeah, but then it also brings you back to those New Testament passages that are like
the spirits imprisoned. Yeah, the day of judgment. That's right.
What I take out of this is, I mean, obviously there's just no way to know, or maybe we shouldn't even be poking it too hard because it's like we're just never going to know. But after reflecting on it, I just think we are connected to the spirit realm or the heavenly realm more than we realize, I think. And this just seems to be like it almost seems mythological. And you'll hear guys like Jordan Peterson or somebody, they often read these passages and they say, yeah, well, they're writing metaphorically, almost like Moses would have been writing Genesis as like a rebuttal to his culture's theories or myths on this stuff. So it's not surprising you find these types of little, jabs in it.
I wouldn't see these as non-historical stories. So if it's
Yeah.
meant mythological in the sense of legends and so on, attempts to make sense of the world and so on, I wouldn't go there. If you mean legend or myth in the sense that you've got these grandiose stories that are somewhat vague of people of great strength that lived a long time ago, then if you mean myth in that sense, that's a different thing because it
Yeah,
is
right.
true that these are larger than life characters who are able to perform great feats of strength. And like it or not, you can't help but think of ancient Greek stories of Hercules
Hmm.
and the Greek gods who had sexual encounters with human women and produced superheroes as well. And you kind of think to yourself, okay, so did that actually happen then? Did people have some sort of a cultural memory of this kind of thing taking place? And is that what's behind all of this? And you're right. It's really hard to get back of all of that and figure out how to deal with these kinds of stories in a proper way. On the flip side, I would say that we sometimes get too stuck in our categories, physical, spiritual, and never the twain shall meet. And there
Mm.
I would say that's more a product of our own philosophical mindset than being necessarily biblical. One of the things that Dudens mentions is he says, well, look, people who say that there could not possibly have been sexual interaction between angels and humans, what about the story of Lot in Sodom? The angelic visitors come to him, and the men of the city surround the town, and they say, bring out those men who are visiting you so that we can have sex with them. Now, could they have, couldn't they have, was this just an illusion? But it shows their depravity, but it also shows that they thought in any case that that was possible.
Yeah, I guess whether or not it was evident that they were angels to those men.
That's
Yes.
it.
More
So
questions. Yeah.
yeah, exactly. You never get out of it.
Yeah, yeah. But it is true. Like, are we closer to the spirit world than we believe we actually
Right.
are, or that we like to think we are? Maybe as close as you get would be like, I have a guardian angel and there are demons around, but I don't like to think about any of this stuff. Um,
Yeah, that's it. And maybe that at least is the precaution for us. We'd rather have our angels placed in heaven and our demons placed in hell and just reserve the human realm for humans. But that's too strictly categorical. Angels are busy on earth and so are demons.